Hi, I'm Jason Jaspersen. Welcome to my studio. Every year for this Jerome Foundation St. John's Pottery Emerging Artist Grant, it's a mouthful, 2 artists are chosen from Minnesota and New York. And that seems like an arbitrary 2 states, but that's the way Jerome Hill wanted it to be, and he, started the foundation. I saw a documentary on Richard Bresnahan and the St. John's Pottery. I would estimate 10 years before I first stepped foot in that building. We had a faculty retreat in St. Cloud, and we were looking for things to do in our off time, and my wife and I saw this on a local Chamber of Commerce list, and we went in, and it was just like I saw in the documentary. It was really cool to be there, but then Richard stopped. There he was in the corner doing his thing. He was kicking a wheel and making magic happen on a wheel, and that just blew my mind, that this guy doesn't know us and he'll just quit, make some tea, sit down and talk with us strangers. That left a big impression on me. My application included images of my work, a resume, and a letter, or a short description of how the pottery residency would benefit me. And the funny part is, I thought I was late. Again, I had intended to apply the year before. I had a note programmed into my phone to be reminded, and I still didn't get it done that year. So here I was trying to apply, and man, I thought I missed it again. On one website, it said I was a day late. But I clicked the link anyways to go to the application site. And at that site, there was a ticking clock that indicated that I still had like 6 hours. I didn't know if that was true. One website said I was too late, and this one said there's a little bit of time. So just in the minutes before the deadline, I had all my stuff together and submitted. Richard commented on my letter. He said a lot of people just sign up for grants, almost as a way of life. And I was very honest that I had never applied for anything like this. And I talked about how my creative life has sort of changed, and I remember a time when I was making things because I wanted to make them, and I described it as art that allowed me to turn my insides out. But in recent years I've been working on a lot of commissions, and what that does is, it kind of puts a different kind of goal in that creative work, somebody else's goal, really. So the benefit of doing this residency was that I could kind of reconnect with what I love about creativity, and reconnect with my own ideas, have some time to really soak in some concepts, and just explore. Okay, well, basically what happens when something is made out of fired clay, we talk about it with different words. Sometimes we say ceramics, sometimes we say terracotta, sometimes we just call it clay. What's really happening is this material is being taken from the earth. It's kind of sticky, a little bit stretchy earth, and it has certain characteristics to it. You can stick your thumb in it and it will grab your thumbprint. It will record that motion, and at the right consistency you can stick your thumb in it and it will keep a hole there, or you can kind of stretch it out and it will hold its shape. I guess nobody really knows the beginning of firing clay, but what happens is when enough heat is applied to this material, to clay, it chemically changes. It begins to melt a little bit on the inside. So the heat is fusing within the walls of that clay and creating something that's no longer flexible, that can become almost watertight, impermeable to water. And so it's been a useful tool for containers. It's been kind of Tupperware for thousands of years. How do you work with it? There are a lot of ways to shape and form clay into something that will hold its shape, or something that might be usable. I think we're probably most used to the idea of working with clay on a wheel. And so in that case, a wheel is spinning and a lump of clay is centered on that wheel. Maybe one of the most difficult steps to get it centered. And then an inside is formed and an outside is sort of pulled up. Imagine like a donut shape, and you're kind of stretching a donut straight up or stretching it in different shapes, and that becomes a vase or a cup or a bowl. Other ways to make things with clay, you could work with coils. So you could take clay and kind of roll it into long snakes and kind of stack it, kind of coil it and stack it on itself and blend it together, and you gradually develop a form by building up these coils. Another way you could work with clay is in sheets. So you could roll clay out into wide flat sheets and then cut it up and kind of build walls with it, or curve it around, and make pretty fast progress that way. There's also a method called pinch pots or pinch sculpture, where you're really just taking a ball of clay and you stick your finger in it and just kind of like pinch around, and it gradually opens up. If you think about the scientific idea of the conservation of mass, with the pinch pot, you always have the same amount of clay. So if you have, say, a tennis ball size ball of clay, and then you redistribute that, you kind of pull it out, you can get a fairly sizable bowl or vase out of that same amount of clay, because you're making the walls thinner. You're opening up the inside and moving that clay into a different shape. What I did a lot of different methods for constructing with clay. In some cases, I was rolling up magazine pages and dipping them in liquid clay to get that clay to stick. And then I knew that the kiln would burn out the magazine page, and I would only have the shell of like the chocolate dipped cone. I also built solid, and if you don't know about ceramics, you know that you can't fire something solid if it's very large. It's almost guaranteed to explode. You know, what I found at the St. John's Pottery was not necessarily techniques or even materials. What I found was an attitude, a stance about creativity. I think that's one of the most important things that I pulled away from this experience. Here's an example. I was watching Richard work on a series of bottles. He had hundreds of these bottles that he had made, and he was at the stage where he was adding some color to the surface. And he would do this thing where he poured a little blue slip in his hand. He'd make a little cup with his hand, pour a little blue slip, and then pour a little white slip. And very slowly, he's paying attention to what he's doing. He kind of swirls it with his finger a little bit. He's just quietly doing this in the corner. Swirls it just a little bit, and then he picks up one of these bottles. He's got a row of them next to him, and he takes his hand and traces a trail of a circle that feeds this slip onto the bottle. And the result on the bottle was this twisting ribbon of color. And I just thought it was fantastic. I watched him do it a few times, and I kind of asked him about it. And one thing Richard made clear in that conversation was that he puts his whole self into that motion. And he's developed that, my head wants to go to the word technique, but that's not what it is. It's just a way of doing something, I guess, that only he could do in that way. And I guess that, that has to do with putting in the time. Some might call it paying your dues. I think the term Richard would use is that's forming a relationship with the material. He said, you can't really teach this. I can't just give this to you because you can't do it because you're not me. And that's not about arrogance. It's about humility, actually. That from that standpoint, I can do things that he can't do. It's kind of like handwriting. Everybody's got a distinct handwriting. So, that stance is a far more personal approach to making art, that each person brings something to the process. And the longer that you work on it, the more you become like yourself. The clay at St. John's Pottery is local. They claim that they have dug and processed 300 years worth of clay for the use of the pottery, which is a specifically Japanese approach, a very long-term approach, and a little baffling, I think, to our sensibilities, especially in the age when we just order something and expect it delivered in 2 days, and it comes from who knows where, maybe the other side of the world, and we just want it on our doorstep now. This is a very different way of approaching life, I think. This idea that maybe the best stuff isn't out there, maybe the best stuff or the stuff that we need is right next to us. So the clay that we worked with, the clay that they've processed and stockpiled, is a little different from clay that I'm used to using. I'm used to a clay that is mixed in batches and shipped around the country. The recipes for clay that most people use in ceramics come from mines from around the country. And there are specific recipes that go into making clay, so it has certain characteristics. Maybe it's made to be very flexible, or maybe it's made to have a high temperature, or maybe it's made for a certain color. But this clay is just what it is. It just comes out of the ground. They sift materials out of it. They screen it wash it, and kind of dry it and bag it up, and that's it. It is what it is. So, you know, it didn't have, like, it kind of didn't have the training wheels that formula clay has. So I had some trouble. I had some things fall over. I had some things come apart in the kiln. You know, 30 days wasn't really enough time to really understand that clay, but I was getting better. That brings up something that Richard talks about. It sounds a little strange, but he talks about developing a relationship with materials. And I think this has to do with thinking with your fingers, thinking with your hands. You know, we're kind of used to understanding learning and thought in cognitive terms. That means that it's up here, it's contained in your brain. But something that was different about the St. John's pottery was just this environment, this idea that it doesn't end here. Our nervous system extends, and our whole body's involved with making. So these guys are, you know, they're kicking a wheel with their feet and making something happen with their fingers that their brain intends. And maybe for a while they can't make what they intend happen. They have to train their body. There's a lot of muscle memory going on with repetition. And that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time to develop a relationship with the material, to really develop a sense, develop a feel for what the clay wants to do, and maybe where its limits are, what it doesn't want to do. Early on, you know, I just went in thinking, well, I can do this. I'm a sculptor. I do all kinds of stuff. And I kind of paid for that. It was kind of an arrogant approach. I just wanted success fast. And the clay thought otherwise. So there's one piece that seemed to be absolutely destined for tragedy at every turn. And I've taken that to kind of, I guess, be its theme. This sculpture, I was very excited one evening and put together probably 10 bags of clay. The sculpture was about this large, solid, of one head, like a grouchy looking guy. And I was feeling good, and I went to bed, you know, like after midnight, and the next morning I came in the studio and it was falling over, just tipped over. And it's a little heartbreaking. So, you know, that's one of those moments where I have to think, okay, what now? What do I do? Do I throw it away? And I did throw a few things away. But this one, you know, I liked too much, and so I held out hope for it. I sliced it up like bread, because this is heavy, you know. I had to transport it somehow without wrecking it. And I just let it sit for probably a couple weeks. And then I hollowed out the center of each slice and carefully tried to reassemble. So, you know, I'm putting a lot of kind of reconstructive effort into this sculpture. And it made it to the kiln. It was intact, everything turned out, didn't get warped too badly, it's looking good. When I saw the sculpture after the firing, it was an absolute mess. Those slices kind of broke open, the back of the head just like collapsed in, caved in, and the heat caused the clay to sort of slump into other works that were in the kiln, and it permanently fused with some cups and bowls that belonged to somebody else. So, you know, it was like there was no end for that piece. It's kind of a piece about the blues, I guess. something that was reinforced for me at the St. John's Pottery was a kind of an optimism about what can be done in a day, what can be done with your hands. You know, I kind of believe in a lot of things that I work with, that the things that you need are close at hand. I don't believe that you necessarily have to have the best materials. You don't have to have the greatest equipment or even the best skills. You kind of just have to have hope. You know, like stick with something long enough and you can turn it into something. So I had a lot of pieces fall over. I had a lot of heartbreak in the early stages of this residency because I wasn't used to the clay. It's a different kind of clay than I'm used to. And, you know, I learned from my grandmother to always have hope for every painting. She taught me a Japanese ink painting method, and every painting, she said, no matter how it's going, you have to, like, it's almost like you're the parent of this artwork, and you never give up on it. So part of this residency, you know, there's a little struggle involved, and it kind of reinforced that idea that you don't give up on an artwork. You stick with it, and maybe it's going to change drastically from what you intended. But in the end, that might be what it was always supposed to be. Richard Bresnahan has a certain stance about creativity and the place of the artist. And, you know, we have kind of stereotypes about the way artists are or should be. Sometimes we picture them throwing tantrums because they don't get their way. You know, at the St. John's Pottery, you learn a very different kind of stance. He says that every piece, every sculpture or bowl or cup is influenced by three forces. One is what it's made of, the material, the clay. So different clay has different characteristics. The second influencer is the artist, the hands, the mind that formed it. And the third is the kiln and the environment of the kiln, what happens in there. So interestingly, you know, where does that put the artist? Well, you're only 1/3 of the equation. You happen to be a transformative force, but really, you know, that clay was what it was and will continue to be that no matter what you do. And the kiln is kind of out of your control. You know, especially this kiln, the St. John's Pottery fires in North America's largest wood firing kiln. A tremendous undertaking, and it's almost like an ecosystem, as I understand it, little climates inside. So, you know, they try to sort of direct the fire, but really it does what it wants to do. So that stance as an artist means that you kind of got to back away from your ego and let some things happen. I'm toying with a term called responsive intent. It might be something I invented as a word, but it's definitely not my concept. Basically, you know, the idea is that you got to roll with it. Something might not go the way you thought, like if my sculptures tip over or if something collapses in the kiln or breaks apart. You got to really seriously think about what to do. The first impulse might be, well, throw it in the trash. But you know, if you slow down and really look at it, it might just be a fork in the road. It might just be a choice about a different kind of outcome. So I guess what I'm advocating is flexibility. And maybe this is part of the optimism thing too, that when it seems like things are going wrong, it might just be that they're going differently than you thought they would. A theme kind of emerged from all of this. Towards the end of my time at the St. John's Pottery, I started to recognize a pattern in my thinking. I started to realize that I'm fascinated by mentorship. I'm fascinated by really what I was steeped in, this idea of education by doing, by really being a part of it. And this may have been a very instrumental drawing, kind of an angel figure giving a piggyback ride. And so, all of this sort of turned into a series of sculptures at the end of my time at the Pottery. In the last 2 days of my experience, I was able to pull off 7 sculptures, whereas early on I was struggling to get one done in a week. So I was kind of hitting that flow state. And the theme of the carriers I find really fascinating and really important. In these sculptures you have 2 figures. You have one that is hauling another one. So the one on top, basically getting a shoulder ride or a piggyback ride, benefits from the work of the other. You could think of it as almost like an upstairs downstairs kind of theme. You could think of it as parenting. You could think of it as commentary on class. But what I want to get at is that whether you're being carried or whether you're doing the carrying, you have a responsibility to the other party to recognize their needs, to recognize the relationship. And sometimes there are times in our lives when we're doing one or the other. There are times in my life when I'm shouldering the responsibility. I'm carrying somebody, putting a lot of time and energy into helping them, and they might be oblivious to that time and energy. They might just be enjoying the view, or they might not really even realize what they have. And at other times, I'm the one being carried, and I realized at the St. John's Pottery that that's where I was. I was being carried, and with time I realized that there's a lot of work, a lot of effort that goes into making that experience fun for me. Other people were doing all kinds of work and being very generous. And so this series is kind of my way of acknowledging that I was having a fun ride and somebody else was doing a lot of work to provide that for me.